by following a psychological map that most people never discover. Not through. Carl Jung revealed that empaths can find their true self by following a psychological map that most people never discover. Not through meditation, not through therapy, not even through years of spiritual seeking. Jung found that empaths possess a unique psychological advantage for individuation, but only if they understand the one shadow pattern that's been keeping them lost in everyone else's emotional world. Picture this moment. You're sitting alone after absorbing someone's heavy emotions all day. A friend's anxiety, a co-worker's frustration, your family's unspoken tension. You feel drained, confused about what's actually yours. You can sense everyone else's inner world with startling clarity, but when you try to connect with your own authentic self, there's just emptiness. Jung spent decades studying what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are beneath all the masks and projections. But he discovered that empaths face a unique challenge. Your greatest gift becomes your greatest obstacle to self-discovery. And once you understand Jung's map, you'll never lose yourself in other people's emotions again. This isn't another spiritual bypass or toxic positivity approach. It's a psychological roadmap that reveals the deepest truths about empathic consciousness. And by the end of this journey, you'll not only reclaim your authentic self, but you'll understand how to use your sensitivity as a superpower rather than a burden. But here's what makes Jung's discovery so disturbing for empaths. Your ability to feel everyone else's emotions isn't just a gift. It's been unconsciously programming you to abandon your own authentic self. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Your empathic nature creates what I call emotional fusion, a psychological state where your boundaries become so permeable that you literally lose track of where you end and others begin. You've been absorbing not just emotions, but entire identity fragments from every person you encounter. Jung understood that empaths face a unique version of what he called the persona problem. While most people wear masks to hide their true selves from others, you've been wearing masks to hide your true self from yourself. Every time you prioritize someone else's emotional needs over your own inner voice, you strengthen the false persona and weaken your connection to what Jung called the self. The real tragedy isn't that you feel too much. It's that you've been taught to believe that feeling everything makes you more spiritual, more evolved, more compassionate. But Jung discovered something that will shatter this illusion. True compassion can only flow from an integrated self, not from a fragmented empath who's lost in other people's emotional chaos. Jung's first insight about empathic individuation centers on what I call the empathic shadow, the parts of yourself you've rejected because they don't fit the sensitive healer identity. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Here's the shadow pattern most empaths refuse to face: your need to be needed. Deep in your unconscious lurks a part of you that secretly enjoys being the emotional savior, the one everyone turns to in crisis. This shadow aspect manipulates through martyrdom, controls through caretaking, and maintains superiority through suffering. You've probably never acknowledged this, but there's a part of you that feels special because you can feel what others can't. A part that gets narcissistic supply from being the chosen one who absorbs everyone's pain. Jung would call this your wounded healer complex, where your identity becomes so tied to healing others that you unconsciously create situations where people need your emotional rescue. But here's where it gets darker. Your empathic shadow also contains your rage, years of suppressed anger at having your boundaries violated, your needs ignored, your authentic self buried under everyone else's emotional demands. You've been taught that anger isn't spiritual, so you've pushed it into the unconscious, where it festers and manifests as passive aggression, victim consciousness, and what Jung called emotional possession. Jung observed that the healthy man does not torture others, Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers. Your shadow contains the potential to use your empathic gifts as weapons. You can manipulate through guilt, control through emotional overwhelm, and punish through withdrawal of your healing presence. The most dangerous aspect of the empathic shadow is projection. You unconsciously cast your disowned anger onto others, seeing them as toxic or narcissistic, while failing to recognize these same patterns operating within yourself. You become what Jung called a shadow hunter, obsessively focused on identifying darkness in others while remaining blind to your own. If you've ever secretly enjoyed being the only one who truly understands someone's pain, comment, "I was their chosen healer." This shadow acknowledgement isn't about shame, it's about integration. Jung taught that the shadow, once conscious, becomes a source of authentic power rather than unconscious manipulation. Jung's second insight reveals how empaths become trapped in what I call the sensitive persona, a false identity built around being emotionally available to everyone except yourself. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Your persona as the empathic healer seems noble, but it's actually a sophisticated defense mechanism. You've learned that being sensitive and selfless earns you love, approval, and a sense of purpose. But this persona requires you to constantly monitor and manage other people's emotional states while neglecting your own. Jung discovered that the stronger your persona, the more your authentic self goes underground. You begin living what I call empathic performance, constantly scanning the room for emotional disturbances, automatically adjusting your energy to soothe others, reflexively absorbing tension without even realizing it. The terrible irony is that your empathic persona actually disconnects you from genuine empathy. True empathy requires clear boundaries, knowing where you end and others begin. But your persona creates what Jung called emotional fusion, where you lose yourself in other people's psychological states. Here's how the trap works. Every time you successfully calm someone's anxiety or absorb their anger, you get a hit of validation that reinforces the persona. You start believing that your worth depends on your ability to emotionally regulate others. Jung called this the helper's high, a form of psychological addiction that keeps you trapped in codependent patterns. But the persona demands a sacrifice, your authentic emotional expression. You learn to suppress your own needs, minimize your own pain, and prioritize everyone else's feelings above your own inner truth. Jung wrote, "The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering." Your legitimate suffering includes the grief of not being seen for who you really are, the rage at having your boundaries constantly violated, and the terror of discovering what's left when you stop being everyone's emotional caretaker. The persona protects you from these painful truths, but it also prevents you from accessing your authentic power. Jung understood that persona breakdown is inevitable. There comes a moment when the false self can no longer sustain itself, when the emotional fusion becomes too exhausting, when the performance feels more like prison than purpose. This breakdown isn't pathology, it's the psyche's attempt to return you to your true self. The question isn't whether your empathic persona will collapse, but whether you'll have the courage to meet your authentic self when it does. You've likely suspected that Jung's map for empathic individuation requires what I call conscious separation, the psychological process of differentiating your authentic self from the emotional fusion you've been living in. Jung wrote, "Individuality is the opposite of being a member of a group, an institution, a race, or a nation." Your experience has probably shown you that individuation means learning to distinguish between your emotions and absorbed emotions, between genuine intuition and anxious hypervigilance, between authentic compassion and codependent caretaking. This process terrifies most empaths because it feels like betraying your core identity. You've likely encountered Jung's 4 stages of empathic individuation in your own journey. First comes shadow integration, consciously acknowledging your need to be needed, your anger at boundary violations, and your secret superiority complex about being more sensitive than others. This stage feels like dying because you're dismantling the identity that's earned you love and purpose. Second is persona dissolution, deliberately letting go of the role as everyone's emotional caretaker. Jung called this the dark night of the soul for empaths, because without the constant drama of other people's problems, you're forced to face the emptiness you've been avoiding. You discover that you don't actually know who you are when you're not fixing someone. Your deeper awareness recognizes the third stage, what Jung called active imagination, learning to dialogue with your own unconscious instead of constantly processing other people's psychological material. This means paying attention to your dreams, honoring your own emotional needs, and developing what I call internal empathy, the ability to feel and validate your own inner experience. The fourth stage is self-realization, the emergence of what Jung called the transcendent function. This is where you develop the capacity to feel deeply without losing yourself, to help others without abandoning your own needs, to be sensitive without being porous. You've probably intuited Jung's warning that individuation isn't a linear process. He wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. You don't solve your empathic challenges, you develop a larger container that can hold both your sensitivity and your sovereignty." Comment if you've started setting boundaries and people called you selfish. I chose myself for the first time. Your wisdom recognizes that empathic individuation requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. You must learn to be both open and boundaried, both compassionate and self-protective, both sensitive and strong. This isn't about becoming less empathic. It's about becoming a conscious empath rather than an unconscious emotional sponge. Jung's most profound insight about empaths involves your connection to what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity. Jung wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." Your empathic sensitivity isn't just picking up individual emotions. You're unconsciously accessing archetypal patterns that Jung identified as universal human experiences. What I call archetypal empathy explains why you sometimes feel overwhelmed in crowds, why certain people trigger inexplicable reactions, and why you can sense things about people that they haven't told you. Jung discovered that empaths are unconsciously channeling what he called archetypal energies, universal patterns like the mother, the warrior, the victim, the savior. When someone activates the victim archetype around you, your unconscious automatically responds by activating the savior archetype. You think you're being compassionate, but you're actually being possessed by an unconscious pattern. This archetypal possession explains why your empathic responses often feel compulsive rather than conscious. You're not choosing to absorb someone's anxiety, you're unconsciously resonating with the collective anxiety that particular person is carrying. Jung called this participation mystique, a psychological state where you lose individual consciousness and become absorbed into collective psychological patterns. But here's Jung's revolutionary insight. Your empathic sensitivity can become a doorway to individuation rather than an obstacle to it. When you learn to consciously work with archetypal energies, instead of being unconsciously possessed by them, you develop what I call sacred empathy, the ability to help others without losing yourself. Jung taught that dreams are the primary way the collective unconscious communicates with individual consciousness. For empaths, dreams often contain guidance about how to maintain your authentic self while honoring your sensitive nature. Pay attention.
I mean, it seems that this day is never going to end, and we have weirder and weirder developments on the case of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And I already maybe psychiatrists or psychologists celebrate, to stand up and say, "Oh, he's okay." No, 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 not at all. So that's why. But this story doesn't add up. J6er Jessica Watkins, I don't want anyone dead, you or anyone else, but why were you so excited to see a man die and now you want to retcon history and act like you weren't happy about it? Please, eye roll emoji. I drew attention so the security team could escape. It was dumb, I don't regret it. Okay, he says that I drew attention so the security team could escape. Wow, that is the best you can come up with? Not even plausible. How did you know where he was?